Hi, boys and girls. It's time for chapter reading. The creek is rising, Christmas is close, and the snow is not coming, just wet, cold rain. And Laura and Mary are so worried that Santa Claus won't be able to come. Well, Mary asked Pa if the creek was going down. He'd just gone out to shoot a big fat turkey. But Pa said it was still rising. Ma said it was too bad. She hated to think of Mr. Edwards eating his bachelor cooking all alone on Christmas Day. Mr. Edwards had been asked to eat Christmas dinner with them, but Pa shook his head and said a man would risk his neck trying to cross that creek now. No, he said, that current's too strong. We'll just have to make up our minds that Edwards won't be here tomorrow. Of course, that meant that Santa Claus would not come either. Laura and Mary tried not to mind too much. They watched Ma dress the wild turkey, and it was a very fat turkey. They were lucky little girls to have a good house to live in and a warm fire to sit by, and such a turkey for their Christmas dinner. Ma said so, and it was true. Ma said it was too bad that Santa Claus couldn't come this year, but they were such good girls that he hadn't forgotten them. He would surely come next year. Still, they were not happy. After supper that night, they washed their hands and faces, buttoned their red flannel nightgowns, tied their nightcap strings, and soberly said their prayers. They lay down in bed and pulled the covers up. It did not seem at all like Christmas time. Pa and Ma sat silent by the fire. After a while, Ma asked why Pa didn't play the fiddle. And he said, I don't seem to have the heart to, Caroline. After a longer while, Ma suddenly stood up. I'm going to hang up your stockings, girls, she said. Maybe something will happen. Laura's heart jumped, but then she thought again of the creek, and she knew nothing could happen. Ma took one of Mary's clean stockings and one of Laura's, and she hung them from the mantel shelf on either side of the fireplace. Laura and Mary watched her over the edge of their bed covers. Now, go to sleep, Ma said, kissing them good night. Morning will come quicker if you're asleep. She sat down again by the fire, and Laura almost went to sleep. She woke up a little when she heard Pa say, You've only made it worse, Caroline. And she thought she heard Ma say, No, Charles, there's the white sugar. But perhaps she was dreaming. Then she heard Jack growl savagely. The door latch rattled, and someone said, Ingalls! Ingalls! Pa was stirring up the fire, and when he opened the door, Laura saw that it was morning. The outdoors was gray. Great fish hooks, Edwards! Come in, man! What happened? Pa exclaimed. Laura saw the stockings limply dangling, and she scrooched her eyes shut into the pillow. She heard Pa piling wood on the fire, and she heard Mr. Edwards say he had carried his clothes on his head when he swam the creek. His teeth rattled and his voice shivered. He would be all right, he said, as soon as he got warm. It was too big a risk, Edwards, Pa said. We're glad you're here, but that was too big a risk for a Christmas dinner. Your little ones had to have a Christmas, Mr. Edwards replied. No creek could stop me after I fetched them their gifts from Independence. Laura sat straight up in bed. Did you see Santa Claus?" she shouted. "I sure did," Mr. Edwards said. "Where? When? What did he look like? What did he say? Did he really give you something for us?" Mary and Laura cried. Wait a minute," Mr. Edwards laughed, and Ma said she would put the presents in the stockings as Santa intended. She said they mustn't look. Mr. Edwards came and sat on the floor by their bed, and he answered every question they asked him. They honestly tried not to look at Ma when she didn't quite see what she was doing. When he saw the creek rising, Mr. Edwards said he'd known that Santa Claus could not cross it. "But you crossed it," Laura said. "Yes," Mr. Edwards replied, "but Santa Claus is too old and fat. He couldn't make it, where a long, lean razorback like me could do so." And Mr. Edwards reasoned that if Santa Claus couldn't cross the creek, likely he would come no farther south than Independence. Why should he come 40 miles across the prairie only to be turned back? Of course he wouldn't do that. So Mr. Edwards had walked to Independence. "In the rain?" Mary asked. Mr. Edwards said he wore his rubber coat. And there, coming down the street in Independence, he'd met Santa Claus. "In the daytime?" Laura asked. She hadn't thought that anyone could see Santa Claus in the daytime. "No," Mr. Edwards said, "it was night, but light shone across the street from the saloons." Well, the first thing Santa Claus said was, "Hello, Edwards." "Did he know you?" Mary asked, and Laura asked, "How did you know he was really Santa Claus?" Mr. Edwards said that Santa Claus knows everybody, and he had recognized Santa at once by his whiskers. Santa Claus had the longest, thickest, whitest set of whiskers west of the Mississippi. So Santa Claus said, "Hello, Edwards. Last time I saw you, you were sleeping on a corn shuck bed in Tennessee." And Mr. Edwards well remembered the little pair of red yarn mittens that Santa Claus had left for him that time. Then Santa Claus said, "I understand you're living now down along the Verdigris River. Have you ever met up down yonder with two little young girls named Mary and Laura?" "I surely am acquainted with them," Mr. Edwards replied. "It rests heavy on my mind," said Santa Claus, "that they are both of them sweet, pretty good little young things, and I know they're expecting me. I surely do hate to disappoint two good little girls like them, yet with the water up the way it is, I can't ever make it across that creek. I can figure no way whatsoever to get to their cabin this year." "Edward," Santa Claus said, "would you do me the favor to fetch them their gifts this one time?" "I'll do that with pleasure," Mr. Edwards said. And then Santa Claus and Mr. Edwards stepped across the street to the hitching post where the pack mule was tied. "Didn't he have his reindeer?" Laura asked. "You know he couldn't," Mary said. "There isn't any snow." "Exactly," said Mr. Edwards. "Santa Claus traveled with a pack mule in the Southwest, and Santa Claus uncinched the pack and looked through it, and he took out the presents for Laura and Mary." Oh my goodness, look at this. So there is Santa Claus on his horse with the pack mule in the back, and there was his bag full of presents. My goodness, how lucky that Mr. Edwards was in town and met Santa Claus. Wow. Oh, what are they? Laura cried, but Mary asked, what did he do? Then he shook hands with Mr. Edwards, and he swung up on his fine bay horse. Santa Claus rode well for a man of his weight and build, and he tucked his long white whiskers under his bandana. So long, Edwards, he said, and he rode away on the Fort Dodge Trail, leading his pack mule and whistling. Laura and Mary were silent an instant, thinking of all of that. Then Ma said, you may look now, girls. Something was shining bright in the top of Laura's stocking. She squealed and jumped out of bed. So did Mary, but Laura beat her to the fireplace, and the shining thing was a glittering new tin cup. Mary had one exactly like it. These new tin cups were their very own. Now they each had a cup to drink out of. Laura jumped up and down and shouted and laughed, but Mary stood still and looked with shining eyes at her own tin cup. Then they plunged their hands down into the stockings again, and they pulled out two long sticks of candy. It was peppermint candy, striped red and white. They looked and looked at that beautiful candy, and Laura licked her stick, just one lick. But Mary was not so greedy. She didn't even take one lick out of her stick. Those stockings weren't empty yet. Mary and Laura pulled out two small packages. They unwrapped them, and each found a little heart-shaped cake. Over their delicate brown tops was sprinkled white sugar. The sparkling grains lay like tiny drifts of snow. The cakes were too pretty to eat. Mary and Laura just looked at them. Oh, this was such a big Christmas for them. So, do you see the new tin cup? And the two sticks of candy? And the two heart cakes? That was a big Christmas. And think of all the things that you get and that I got. It's very different a long time ago. At last, Laura turned hers over, and she nibbled a tiny nibble from underneath, where it wouldn't show. And the inside of that little cake was white. It had been made of pure white flour and sweetened with white sugar. Laura and Mary never expected, and they never would have looked in their stockings again. The cups and the cakes and the candy were almost too much. They were too happy to speak, but Ma said if they were sure the stockings were empty, then they put their arms down inside them to make sure, and in the very toe of each stocking was a shining, bright, new penny. They never thought of having such a thing as having a penny. Thinking, of having a whole penny for your very own. And having a cup and a cake and a stick of candy and a penny. There never had been such a Christmas. Now, of course, right away, Laura and Mary should have thanked Mr. Edwards for bringing the lovely presents all the way from Independence, but they had forgotten all about Mr. Edwards. They'd even forgotten about Santa Claus. In a minute, they would have remembered, But before that, Ma said, "Aren't you going to thank Mr. Edwards?" And we have more to read about that wonderful Christmas day. Bye, boys and girls. Until next time.